Welcome to today's Mackinder Forum. I'm Len Hochberg, the U.S. Coordinator. Please permit me to abbreviate the biographical statements available in your introductory materials. Our first speaker, Dr. Michaela Dodge, is a research scholar at the National Institute for Public Policy, NIP. Prior to joining the National Institute, Dr. Dodge worked at the Heritage Foundation. She left Heritage to serve as Senator John Kyle's Senior Defense Policy Advisor between October to December 2018. Her last position at Heritage was as a research fellow for missile defense and nuclear deterrence. Michaela's recent publications include two NIP occasional papers, Russian escalation threats in its war against Ukraine, and U.S. domestic polarization and its implications for Allied assurance. Our second speaker, Dr. Jeff McCausland, is a visiting professor at Dickinson College and a former Minerva chairholder, U.S. Army War College. He is a retired colonel, holds a PhD from the Fletcher School, and is a West Point graduate. Military assignments include the Army Staff, Battalion Command during the Gulf War, Dean of the Army War College, and Director for Arms Control, National Security Council staff at the White House. In 2020, he published a book, Battle Tested Leadership Lessons for the 21st Century Leaders. Jeff is a national security consultant for CBS and a contributor of original analytic articles on geopolitics and geostrategy to the Mackinder Forum website, for which we are grateful. Dr. John Swegle's work, our third speaker, Dr. John Swegle, works as an independent consultant through the National Strategic Research Institute at the University of Nebraska on a range of issues related to the effects of nuclear weapons and proliferation on U.S. national security. He began his career at the Sandia National Laboratories as a member of the Plasma Theory Group, then moved to the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, where he participated in and managed multidisciplinary analyses of foreign technology and nuclear programs. At Lawrence Livermore, he also worked in a nuclear design division for several years. Just prior to becoming an independent consultant, he was senior advisory scientist in the National Security Studies section at the Savannah River National Laboratory. John holds a PhD in applied physics from Cornell University. The Mackinder Forum is delighted to have three distinguished individuals address the following topic: arms control, nuclear testing, and U.S. national security strategy. And with that, please, Michaela, begin.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm really glad to be back here. And I think I'm going to be a bit of a heretic among colleagues, which should lead to some spirited discussions and debates. I'm going to continue with the thought that I presented at the last Mackinder Forum that I participated in. And my main thesis is that for our current national security predicaments, arms control just does not matter that much because it has no innate ability to change relations among nations. And what I mean by that is that arms control reflect political relations between states, but they cannot change political relations between states. And really, our key national security problems are revisionist powers bent on altering the status quo. That should direct our thinking about arms control rather than pursuing arms control for the sake of arms control. The revisionist powers are the problem, and it's not just that they have revisionist intentions, it's also that they connect their political means to the weapons they're pursuing. And so, whereas we tend to think about nuclear weapons as this dinosaur of the Cold War era, Um, they have much more sophisticated conceptual thinking about arms control, about their nuclear weapons, how those weapons serve political means they're trying to achieve, and they think through different operational scenarios in which they use nuclear weapons to achieve their political objectives. They plausibly do not think that a detonation of a few low-yield nuclear weapons is the end of the world. Uh, this somewhat alarmist thinking you can sometimes see in US nuclear policy community. Related to related to this train of thought is the notion that what the United States does is the sole or the main driver of adversaries' strategic posture choices. In other words, that whatever programs we pursue, however we choose to pursue those programs, automatically causes a reaction. Usually, it's escalatory reaction on the part of U.S. adversaries. Um, Now, U.S. adversaries would be stupid, and they're not stupid, if they did not consider what the United States is doing with its nuclear forces. But it's not the mechanistic action reaction thesis that has been permanent stay in US nuclear arms control advocacy for half a century at least. There are different factors that impact weapons that adversaries are going to procure, and they are faced with trade-offs, even though they're a little bit different kinds of trade-offs than what we are faced with. Um, they just do not follow where the United States leads. And I think what happened after the end of the Cold War is just the most visible testament of it. We almost unilaterally reduced our regional nuclear forces. We completely stopped nuclear testing. And this is not just full-scale instrumented experiments at Nevada. This is all hydrodynamic experiments. And I know John is going to be talking more about what that means and how adversaries approach that. It's also a deterioration of our regional nuclear posture and its inability the most, I think, to me, the most serious aspect of it is the related deterioration within the nuclear complex itself. So what you'll see during the Cold War is that the nuclear weapons complex could deal with any challenge that we threw at it. It was never a big part of the discussion during arms control during the Cold War whether the US nuclear weapons complex will be able to respond. That's not the kind of flexibility and resilience that we have today. In fact, I would argue we have almost no flexibility and almost no resilience within our nuclear weapons complex as a result of the choices that we did when we thought that it was the end of end of history and everybody is going to be getting on peacefully together. In fact, I would argue that arms control, as pursued by the United States, actually harms its and allied interests rather than advances them. And one of the ways how I think the manifestation of this is is the state of US extended deterrence. So towards the end of the Cold War, we signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and we signed it on the premise that we are going to be developing new regional nuclear weapon capabilities, and we are going to modernize our strategic forces. With the end of the Cold War, we pretty much did not do either of those things. Only now we are slowly started nuclear modernization program, and that program of record was put in place when we thought that Russia will not cheat on New START, and when we thought that there is no nuclear peer competitor on the horizon. Those are the assumptions that went into New START nuclear forces posture. They're not true anymore, and so I will not be sad when the treaty finally expires next month, hopefully. The other aspect of that are the presidential nuclear initiatives in the 1990s. So we unilaterally reduced and dismantled most of our tactical nuclear forces, and the Russians said that they would do the same, except as usual, they didn't. They are in violation of their political commitments under the presidential nuclear initiatives and have been for a long time. They have active regional nuclear force program because their thinking about regional nuclear forces is very much integrated with their conventional thinking. In in that context, I touched upon the deterioration of the nuclear infrastructure. We cannot produce, we have for 20 years, over 20 years, we have been trying to put in place a plan to produce plutonium pits for our warheads. There is almost no margin within the nuclear weapons complex to come up with new nuclear capabilities or new weapon designs. We do have annual certification process in place. The purpose of that process is to certify that the warheads are going to perform up to specs and as we expect. But that process does not tell you anything. It's not designed to. It doesn't tell you about what kind of military capabilities you might need in the future. And so I feel like our job as policymakers is open up that space where people at the labs can make judgments to the best of their technical ability and knowledge to come up with capabilities that strengthen and support deterrence that manifestly has been fraying for the past at least a decade. I would like to touch on asymmetric impact that arms control has in democracies. And this is something that we know out of historical experience. We have observed the dynamic in the UK after the Versailles Treaty, in the United States after the Versailles Treaty, in the United States prior to World War I, certainly during the Cold War. Democracies negotiate their nuclear arsenals among themselves even before they get to the negotiating table with the adversaries. And so, there is no unrestrained nuclear arms race if there is no formal arms control. You will still have those kinds of negotiations within democracies, and you will have similar negotiations, even though under different kinds of pressures and evaluating different factors in US adversarial countries. Armaments are always limited because resources are limited. And so it comes down to political will to spend resources on weapons. If our adversaries want to pursue weapons that they consider useful, it really does not matter whether we have arms control agreements with them or not. We are notoriously awful about enforcing arms control. In fact, Russia has been violating New START for a couple of years now with almost no consequences. It has violated every single arms control agreement we've ever signed with them. And it's extremely difficult for democratic governments to truly punish noncompliance with arms control treaties, partially because the governments are invested in the current status quo. Again, very obvious, not just nuclear problem, it's a problem with conventional arms control too. There are other problematic notions that sort of try to impact US debate about arms control. One of them is that the United States has a launch on warning nuclear posture, but that has never been US nuclear posture. We have the capability to launch on warning, but that's not the posture. And the other one is, again, it comes from that arms action reaction notion that if the United States resumes nuclear testing, it will accelerate these trends. Well, no, these trends have started way before, United States even considered resuming nuclear tests. And by the way, our adversaries do not adhere to U.S. interpretation of what constitutes a nuclear weapons test. Again, John will talk about that some more. Now, I'm going to close with a quotation that will be well familiar to the Mackinder audience. Hope, dangerous comforter, may be indulged in by those who have abundant resources, if not without loss, at all events without ruin. But its nature is to be extravagant, and those who go so far as to put their all upon the venture see it in its true colors only when they're ruined. And that sort of has been the story of arms control in the United States throughout the decades. And with that, I'm looking forward to what should be a spirited discussion.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Len, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Michaela, for a wonderful introductory set of remarks. What I'm going to talk about quickly is really two things. One, national security in terms of strategy, and number two, then proliferation. And as an old War College faculty member and dean of the War College, we traditionally have always argued or described strategy to our students at those places as having three components: ends, ways, means, and of an evaluation of risk. So the end is of your objectives, what you're trying to accomplish. I'm going to talk about this Trump NSS here in a second. The ways are policy, and means are the resources, weapon systems, and like that you devote to all that. If you look at the Trump NSS that was delivered in December of 2025, and many people say these are documents that are long and not frequently read, but I think it does have some important components. The first is that it wants to stress that the world's most robust, credible, and nuclear deterrent is what the United States is trying to achieve as a core policy of the American first security. This has several components. One is modernization, so we can achieve military overwatch of our military forces, including our nuclear arsenal. Second is to look at next generation weapon systems, particularly in defense. A central priority for that is, of course, the Golden Dome missile defense system. Third, it doesn't talk about arms control specifically, but it talks about reestablishing strategic stability with the Russian Federation. But there's not really a roadmap and all that, and it doesn't say much of anything about, of course, New START or arms control. And then finally, you look at the portions about, to me, allied relations. The strategy talks that the U.S. may boost and adapt its extended deterrent for allies, but there's no real, and it's really one of the first times, a discussion of extended deterrence and what that means for allies around the world. And second of all, then I would say that this NSS takes a significantly different approach to nuclear proliferation as I move on to that, moving away from, as Michaela described so well, perhaps arms control, and to a strategy more emphasizing what I would call peace through strengths. It doesn't really have a declaratory policy in it about proliferation and what that means for U.S. and its allies. And of course, it encourages allied independence, more self-help, more stepping up by our European and Asian allies. So if that's the end of strategy and some of the ways, let's talk about means for a minute. In terms of means, the United States, of course, is involved right now in one of the largest modernizations of our nuclear forces that we have ever attempted. Probably about $1.7 trillion we're going to spend over a number of years. That actually began prior to Mr. Trump being inaugurated. But I hasten to add, since you all are taxpayers out there, every one of these systems are experiencing enormous cost overruns. Whether you're talking about the development of new submarines for ballistic missile launch, whether you're talking about a new bomber system, or whether you're talking about ICBM. So, as is sadly the case throughout my lifetime for major weapon systems, they're going to arrive later and they're going to cost a whole heck of a lot more. Okay. Number two, it's cut the budgets, particularly in personnel, particularly in places like State Department, DOD, and the Department of Energy, which I would argue, sort of back to Michaela's point, if you were going to conduct a nuclear test, and John will talk about it in more detail, I'm not sure we have the capacity in people right now because so many of them went out the door with the reduction in the force. And then finally, in terms of the cost, I think it's important to keep in mind not only are the weapon systems, the offensive capabilities rising in cost, but I don't really know if anybody on this call can tell me how much Golden Dome is going to cost. Please pop up early. The administration has said about $150 billion. The numbers I've seen are more like in the $600 to $700 billion category to pay for Golden Dome if you're ever going to get there. Let's move on to the NPT. And first of all, what the heck is this NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty? Signed in 1968, about 191 countries have signed up to it. And today, around the world, as best we can tell, only about 9 countries, US, Brits, French, Russian, Chinese, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea have nuclear weapons. Only 1 country has acquired a nuclear weapon in the last 50 years, 25 years, that being, of course, the DPRK. When the treaty was signed, but of course, this reflects the Cold War, there were about 36,000 nuclear weapons on this particular planet. Today, it's slightly over 12,000 at best we can tell. Is that better? You can argue it both ways because the ones we got are a lot more accurate than they were back in the day. Some countries began nuclear programs and discarded them along the way. South Africa is one. Libya is another. But I think it's important to realize this agreement has 2 parts. Part number 1 is the countries that signed up to it, who didn't have nuclear weapons, agreed that they would not acquire weapons, but they opened up the possibility that they could benefit from nuclear energy. Think of the recent agreement with Saudi Arabia, perhaps for them to develop nuclear energy. On the same token, the other part of the agreement, which is not talked about very much, to my mind, is that the great powers, nuclear powers, agreed to limit, if not reduce, their nuclear stockpiles. So you can argue whether that was wise or not, but that is part of the agreement. It seems to me, at least, we have growing concerns as we think about nuclear weapons, expansion of weapons, expansion of arsenals around the world. And some might say it's a blinding flash of the obvious. Obviously, the United States and our Israeli allies are very concerned about Iran. That's why we conducted a massive bombing raid on Iran back in June of this year. Concern right now as we see instability in Iran. Will they, in fact, negotiate, if they've now suggested, to limit their arsenal, or will they seek breakout and create a nuclear deterrent? Obviously, the Chinese, and I think Michaela alluded to that in her remarks, are trying to expand their particular weapon systems, probably shooting for strategic weapons in around the 1,000 warhead category. Trump administration has actually talked about, at times, the president did a lot in his first term, about negotiations involving the Russian Federation, the United States, and the Chinese. My read, my colleagues can chime in, that I don't think the Chinese are terribly interested until they get to about that 1,000 warhead arsenal, and then they can think they might be able to negotiate. To echo Michaela, certainly the Russians have used the nuclear saber and threatened that throughout the conflict and developed some new weapon systems, longer range cruise missiles, as well as a long range nuclear torpedo. And it's very unlikely, and I think Michaela is right, that the New START treaty will show its demise here in a few weeks. And finally, in that regard, we've seen a closer cooperation between the Russians and the DPRK. Might that translate into assistance to the North Koreans for missile design, warhead design, or either nuclear weapons? Remains to be seen, of course. If you turn to the North Koreans, of course, they have been tried to drop out of the agreement. That's why there are a lot of sanctions against North Korea. We've seen them trying to expand their threat. We've seen them testing recently what they argue was a hypersonic weapon. And then, of course, we had the recent war in May between India and Pakistan. Now, I hasten to add, neither of these countries are signatory, but it certainly suggests the possibility of nuclear conflict on the planet. I know from some other work that I've done on that regard, a real concern is that war got underway, that did, in fact, the Pakistanis, for example, immediately disperse their stockpile to enhance its invulnerability. And having done so, obviously, is very, very escalatory. And then, so it's, I think, in our best interest to try to restrain the expansion of that and try to reduce the tensions that they have. There has been a simulation exercise that I was involved with on the periphery that suggested for these 2 countries, even a limited exchange of about 50 weapons, 25 on each side, they have about 300, could result in 50 to 125 million immediate deaths because of the dense population in South Asia, and could result in a nuclear winter that would cause large-scale starvation across the Asia-Pacific region because of what that might imply. Now, you can argue with that, but I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not a small affair if, in fact, they should do that. Of course, the United States has the other responsibility of how you manage this in terms of our allies, which I think is probably, in terms of proliferation, the most likely place that this might occur. We know about the decision recently to negotiate agreement with the Saudi Arabians, as we've done with the United Arab Emirates, to allow them to develop nuclear reactors. I think it'll be important that there is oversight on that, ensuring that the material is not enriched to a weapons grade status. And then, of course, the discussion over the last year or so about what U.S. commitments are to NATO has caused really shockwaves throughout the alliance. And we've seen really very interesting things happen. Actually, several European leaders, most notably the Poles and the Germans, who do not have nuclear weapons, that actually talked about possibly we need to acquire some. We've also seen the United Kingdom and France seek to provide an alternative nuclear security guarantee for Europe if, in fact, the United States is no longer willing to do that. And I think it's also important, back to previous nuclear programs, to remind everyone, countries like Sweden at one time, believe it or not, had a nuclear program, which they discarded at some point during the Cold War. But clearly all those countries have the industrial capacity if they wanted to go in that particular direction. If you move to Asia real quick, growing concern, you could say, on the Korean Peninsula. Polls suggest 70% of all South Koreans believe that South Korea should acquire a nuclear weapon to deter threats by, in fact, North Korea. At the same time, of course, we just signed an agreement with South Korea, like we have with Australia, to assist them in the construction of a nuclear-powered submarine. Now, I hasten to add, that's not a nuclear-powered submarine for launch of missiles. It's more of an attack submarine, but it is a sharing of those kind of technologies. And finally, in the Asia-Pacific region, of course, is Japan. Now, some people say it's unheard of to think that the Japanese would move towards nuclear weapons, and I think it's still pretty unlikely, but I would argue two things which I have found of interest. One is the Japanese have talked about doubling their defense spending, which, because of the size of their economy, if they go to 2% or so of GDP, that brings them right up to somewhere around the Russian level in terms of defense spending, number one. And number two, the current tensions between China and Tokyo over remarks made by the Chinese Prime Minister that an attack by China on Taiwan could actually involve a response by Japan. So what does that mean for the future? Well, number one, I think the United States, which has been a leader of the nonproliferation movement, needs to decide whether or not we want to continue doing that and discourage proliferation around the world, or perhaps move towards a strategy which harkens back to what Winston Churchill talked about at the onset of the nuclear age. And that was a porcupine strategy, which said, well, if everybody's got nuclear weapons, then we all will be deterred from using them. That causes me, frankly, a little bit of concern, but that's a possibility. And I think serious considerations should be given to greater investments, quite frankly, in things like diplomatic, economic, military, and technological tools that underpin our efforts to slow the spread of nuclear weapons, bolster nonproliferation, and reduce the possibility of armed conflict. I'll give you an example. Again, Chatham House rules. I've been involved at times in serious negotiations with both Pakistan and India. Never going to get them probably to roll back on their arsenals, but simple things like, would they agree to hotlines between the two capitals that might reduce the possibility of a crisis, which will occur in South Asia, I guarantee it, doesn't go off the rails very, very suddenly. And then finally, I think the evidence is clear. The more states with nuclear weapons, we have to admit, means a higher risk of their use, and furthermore, a possibility of a terrorist organization acquiring. Candidly, back to my work with India and Pakistan, quite honestly, one of our concerns was ensuring not so much that the Pakistanis didn't increase their stockpile, but that they had the means available to protect their stockpile. And as I like to say, please don't quote me, if you're a country that has more terrorist organizations than zip codes, having a lot of nuclear weapons is just not the greatest idea, okay? To close up, I would say, in thinking about nuclear weapons development, planning, proliferation, for this audience, it would seem to me, most of us, as I know on this call, spent our careers talking about these topics, but somewhere around the end of the Cold War, we quit talking about this. We quit talking about nuclear theory and the implications of proliferation, et cetera. And I think it's now high time that we resurrect at least a discussion about that, so we can intelligently, at the highest levels and throughout the society, discuss the aspects of these particular weapon systems and other ends, ways, and means to prevent the use of nuclear weapons in conflict. With that, I will conclude, and I will turn the platform over to my good friend, John.
Thank you very much. And thanks to my predecessors for filling me with more thoughts than I could possibly address in the time allowed to me. But I'll stick, and I want to thank the Mackinder Forum for having me here. This is my first time with them. I'm going to focus on a particular arms control agreement. the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty for two reasons. One, because it's been in the news lately, and two, because it raises issues that I believe make it possible to make some general observations about arms control and the value to U.S. national security. So, the news. President Donald Trump on 29 October 2025 in Truth Social highlighted a problem with the CTBT. I don't want to get into a full consideration of his message. However, he did raise an important CTBT related issue. Let me quote him. Because of other countries' testing programs, I've instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis. We won't get into NNSA versus Department of War on nuclear testing, but the next day, he clarified this statement that, in a way, I think was really provocative about the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So, 60 Minutes interview with Norah O'Donnell. And I want to read the quotes because the exact wording is extremely important for interpreting what's being talked about. So, Norah O'Donnell asks, are you saying that after more than 30 years, the United States is going to start detonating nuclear weapons for testing? Detonating nuclear weapons. In the full transcript, not just looking at what was televised, but in the full transcript, the full answer was, I'm saying that we're going to test nuclear weapons like other countries do. Yes, Russia's testing nuclear weapons and China's testing them too. You just don't know about it. Key point. I think I associate detonating nuclear weapons with making the ground shake. Nobody's seeing the ground shake. So he's talking about something different. Nevertheless, it does relate intimately to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And he went on to discuss how the tests were basically undetectable from outside the test locations. So, do we know about Russian and Chinese nuclear testing? Actually, we do. Multiple compliance reports from the U.S. State Department across administrations of both parties, this is not a partisan issue, have called out what the U.S. regards as non-CTBT compliant testing by Russia at the Novaya Zemlya nuclear test site. For those who enjoy reading compliance reports, it's there. It's been there for years now. Similar concerns are expressed about the non-transparency of Chinese activities at their Lop Nor test site and the possibility of similar non-compliant CTBT non-compliant testing there. Also, in a 2019 at the Hudson Institute that got a lot of play at the moment in the press, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Lieutenant General Robert Ashley, stated, quoting again, the U.S. believes Russia probably is not adhering to the nuclear testing moratorium. Now, that's a rather reserved way of saying what's in the compliance reports as well. So President Trump, in his recent comment, has drawn our attention back to a substantive problem with the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It's the zero yield feature of the treaty that essentially makes it unverifiable at the low end. Experiments involving the explosive assembly of fissile material, plutonium, for example, can be conducted at seismically undetectable yield levels. Ground isn't going to shake. We're not going to detect it remotely at a distance. But those tests can be relevant to, for example, the single point safety of a nuclear device or weapon, or the beginning stages of fission in a nuclear weapon configuration. You can take it down to the level where you can learn something relevant to the operation of a nuclear weapon, but the yield levels are undetectable. So, compounding this issue, the treaty language contains no definition of this testing zero yield threshold. Unlike other treaties that contain a long list of definitions, go to the threshold test ban treaty, which incidentally we'll come back to him. Paul Robinson was involved in negotiating, and there's a long list of definitions, and all the other treaties I've looked at. Subsequent to the signing of the treaty, the U.S. State Department released its definition of what constitutes CTBT compliance. It says the agreement, I'm quoting again, the agreement prohibits all nuclear explosions that produce a self-sustaining, supercritical chain reaction of any kind, whether for weapons or peaceful purposes. In such a chain reaction, each fission event releases enough neutrons to create more than one subsequent fission, so that the system becomes self-sustaining. And if you look at the growth, it actually grows momentarily, instantaneously at an exponential rate, not the exponential of meaning big, but the mathematical form of an exponential growth rate. It's like population growth, really. According to the U.S. chief negotiator, the late Stephen Ledigar, here's a quote: "Did Russia agree that hydronuclear experiments, which do produce a nuclear yield, this self-sustaining chain reaction, do they produce a self-sustaining supercritical chain reaction of any kind?" Oh, no. He said, "Did Russia agree that hydronuclear experiments, which do produce a nuclear yield, although usually very, very slight, would be banned, and that hydrodynamic experiments, which have no yield because they do not reach criticality, would not be banned?" The answer is a categorical yes. I went back and looked up categorical. That means no doubt about it. It's an unqualified yes. The Russians, as well as the rest of the P5, did commit themselves, and the State Department contains quotes from a number of Russian officials acknowledging this definition of what is allowed and disallowed by the treaty. Of course, at the time the treaty was being negotiated, politics were an issue. At the same time the CTBT was being negotiated in Geneva, the treaty was open for signature in September 1996, the indefinite extension of the NPT, which Jeff has just discussed, was under consideration at the 1995 NPT Review Conference. This was whether or not the treaty would hold for the original limited time period, or whether we would say it's an unlimited extension. The U.S. and the nuclear weapon states very much wanted unlimited extension, which was agreed upon in May of 1995. So while we're thinking about extending the NPT, the issue is whether or not the CTBT is going to prohibit all nuclear tests, or whether or not it's going to prohibit most of them. So this zero threshold became extremely important, really politically, because of the unverifiability at the lowest level. So, and the CTBT clearly conflates, if you read the treaty, clearly conflates the goals of eventual nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation. As reported by Anna Pacelli and Bruce Goodwin in a 2020 report from LLNL, it's on the readings. I really recommend the report if this is a subject of interest for you. It's excellently written. The DOE National Laboratories originally proposed lower limits or non-zero limits for testing. It would serve the purposes of examining the stability of our nuclear weapons. It would serve the purposes of long-term maintenance of the weapons. However, when they proposed that, and when it went out as proposed language for the treaty, the nonproliferation and disarmament communities rebelled, with the result that DOE Secretary Hazel O'Leary successfully pushed for a zero yield threshold. International politics continues to play a role. In a way, you can view Trump's remark and the subsequent remarks by Vladimir Putin and the Russian National Security Council as an exchange. Trump calls out the Russians for cheating. Putin uses the language of a National Security Council meeting, a Russian Federation Security Council meeting, to say, nope, we have strictly adhered to our obligations under the CTBT, paraphrasing him, and he said that Russia would test if the US tested. What is this? This is an exchange. This is a political exchange. Two national leaders taking shots at each other. So where are we today with the CTBT? Of the P5 states, France and UK have signed and ratified. The US and China have signed but not ratified, and Russia recently revoked its ratification. As I said, the CTBT remains essentially unverifiable at the low end. Verification for these very low yield hydronuclear tests, supercritical tests that we regard as prohibited, would be incredibly intrusive. Nevertheless, those supercritical tests do open up an experimental range of nuclear device operation that is otherwise unacceptable with compliant tests, as noted by Paul Robinson. CTBT is also unlikely to enter into force. There's the Annex II states that are required to ratify in order for the treaty to enter into force. This is India, Pakistan, and North Korea on that list. Iran is on that list. This doesn't happen anytime soon. So it does raise a question. And Jeff referred to this. As superpower confrontation grows, what role will a test ban play on the middle powers? South Korea and Poland, possibly Japan, as they begin to ask about the value of U.S. extended deterrence. And then where is this going for the U.S.? Well, you can make this argument, actually. The U.S. is well situated. We're not bound by ratification at this point, but we continue to strictly observe the restrictions of the treaty. Our continued observation raises the penalty for testing by other states. It helps raise the penalty. Final point, treaties and agreements to one degree or another constitute a form of a bet on the future. Michaela mentioned the presidential nuclear initiatives of 1991 and 1992. They were a bet predicated on the idea that Russia was coming around after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that in fact the PNIs would help push the Russians down the right track by getting both sides to either eliminate or put in storage large classes of non-strategic nuclear weapons. Did it work? We've adhered to that agreement. The Russians have not. It's a longer discussion, but they have not. And so in that sense, it was a bad bet because there's a certain, I would regard, and I hope it's not too frivolous, but I regard this as having a certain Roach Motel effect. We've pulled our weapons out of Europe. We've gotten rid of them. You can get in, you can't get out. Or you can get out, but there's a penalty for getting out, just as our adherence to the CTBT creates a penalty. So using this perspective, to me, the CTBT looks like a good bet. Really, the only full-scale testing since the treaty was first issued were the tests by India and Pakistan in '98 and North Korea's testing. The asymmetry, there is an asymmetry created, nevertheless, between our strict adherence and the qualified non-adherence by Russia and China. There are things they can do that we can't, And the possibility is that this creates unknown unknowns for us. Bruce Goodwin and Anna Pacelli's report in 2020 talks about how we have narrowed that window of vulnerability created by the asymmetry, but they have to admit it hasn't disappeared. So I think at this point, probably on balance, the CTBT is a good bet for the US. And probably the problems with the treaty wouldn't even be solved by ratification by the US, Russia, and China at this point. We're getting what we're going to get from the treaty.
Thank you, John. Thank you all very much.